This episode of the Leap Forward podcast is brought to you by Bridge LT, leaders in conversational learning and innovation. Through AI role plays, technical simulators, and comprehensive training programs, Bridge LT is revolutionizing the future of corporate and enterprise education.
Today on Leap Forward, we welcome Linda Jackson, a seasoned automotive expert who has recently retired after a remarkable career in the industry. Linda offers a unique perspective on the seismic shifts in the automotive world, from an unplanned start with a holiday job at Jaguar to her later role as CEO of Citroën and Peugeot. She discusses the industry's focus on electrification, autonomous technology, and evolving car ownership, and why she thinks the next decade will see more changes than the previous 40 years. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to this episode of Leap Forward, Linda. Thank you so much for joining us. You're currently the CEO of Peugeot.
Well, I'm not actually. I've just taken retirement. So I literally am now moving into a second or third phase of my life. So we'll see what we're going to do.
How exciting. Well,
super exciting.
Let's kind of start with you and I suppose in a sense your kind of career to date. What were some key kind of moments along that sort of journey?
Oh, I mean, I think the first key moment, I've been in the automotive business all my career. But in fact, I entered it completely by accident, which I think is the first momentous moment. I took a holiday job whilst waiting to go to university. And it happened to be at Jaguar, very famous British, as was then British firm. And I decided not to go to university and to stop on and then obviously do a master's, sponsored and what have you.
Yeah.
So I suppose that was the first momentous thing, which was I entered into the automotive business, and you could say to yourself, well, why on earth did you decide to stop in it and not go off to be, which I actually wanted to be, a history teacher? And it was because I could see there were so many opportunities, and also the whole product of selling cars, designing cars, manufacturing cars, whatever it may be, was so exciting. And that's why I've been in this business 40 years. So I would say that was the most momentous, entering it, never wanting to change out of it. And I think probably the next thing is literally being able to work in France, moving back, etc. And then obviously all of the latter roles that I've had, whether it be in head of Citroën, for example, worldwide, or for Peugeot just recently, they're momentous times in my career because they challenge you completely. Yeah, I moved from something when I came to be in charge of Citroën, I moved to something that was it was quite important at the time, but just in charge of the UK for Citroën, to be the brand CEO worldwide. And that's, if, in your management and your whole leadership, that's a completely different step. So I suppose they're the momentous occasions. One, entering into the automotive business, and then obviously moving in as a personal thing. But then, of course, I would say perhaps since last 5 years, what's changing in the automotive is, well, it's staggering. I think more is going to happen in the next 5-10 years than happened in the previous 40, to be honest with you. And it's just amazing what I've seen through my life. The first car I had, going back 40 years, we didn't have electric windows. Now everybody thinks, how could you possibly exist without an electric window or a radio in the car? And now we're moving into electrification, we're moving to software, we're moving into smartphones this is exciting times, huh?
It is. And I suppose in a sense, sort of, you've got this unique perspective now in terms of your sort of view of how fast things are going to change. But even from me, looking back over the last 40 years, as you just described, in terms of going from analog as effectively to where we are today, what were those kind of key moments, not necessarily for your career, but more for the industry, that you think really changed, that, you're able to now see with that kind of 2020 kind of hindsight, I suppose?
I think one of the major things that changed, particularly for European manufacturers, was the introduction and following of the quality from Honda, Toyota, particularly Honda. So I think, you can go back 30, 40 years and people used to criticize British-made cars, British Leyland.
Hmm.
They used to criticize French cars because of the quality. But I think one of the major things that have changed moving forward is not only the manufacture of the vehicles in terms of the quality, finish, etc., but all of the security that we have on the cars now. And that is quite amazing. You can go back 40 years and we talk about electric windows and there were wind-round windows and there were radios, but you had none of the safety things that we had, apart from safety belts, none of those things, which have made driving so much safer. And I think that's probably, in the previous 30 years, the most significant is the buildup of all of the security, safety, and all of the things that we're now doing in terms of the materials we use to make the vehicles, which are so much safer for in terms of collision and crash. So I think that would be the most impactful for me. And then really we move into the technology. And the technology that you started to see even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that you start to see all of the things that we now think are just normal that we should have, which we didn't have. But I think probably the security safety is one of the major factors that moved forward. And of course, the amount of choice that people have has changed as well. I mean, we all go back. I don't go back to when Ford first made his car,
Any colour.
amazingly enough, but it's okay if it's black. But of course, now you can have whatever trim level you want, et cetera, and you've got the choice. So I think that those two things are perhaps the difference. And then, of course, we move into the powertrain and if you like, the more ecological, most importantly, as we move forward in terms of making sure that we save the CO2, the emissions, and all of those sort of things. But going back, if I think back 40, 30 years, quality, safety, has the way that we buy our cars changed dramatically? I don't think so particularly. Now it's changing because people will buy online. People want an experience. But I think they're the sort of major things that sort of hit me.
Interesting. I was going to ask you about the sort of the customer, I suppose, in a sense, and the drive, the driving experience, the driving behaviors. You sort of talked about the kind of customer buying and the customer buying journey, perhaps, now really being, challenged, changing a lot. But what about the actual kind of driving experience itself from a customer and driver perspective?
Well, I mean, you can. This is a little bit like the debate that I have with many times with people about electric vehicles, and people say, "But I love driving cars. I don't want an electric vehicle," which is stupid because actually, electric vehicles are an absolute pure pleasure to drive. So, has it changed? And then we go back to automatic and manual, yeah. And I was reading something just recently. It was an article saying that the UK is now becoming automatic. Well, everywhere in the world is becoming automatic, yeah. But we used to be so precious about the changing gear, and still people still are, and that's why they hold on to their old cars and what have you. So has the way we drive cars changed? Well, yes, it has, and I think that's come with some of the changes we've had in the cars in terms of security, safety, but also the laws that have come on, and all of the things that the manufacturers now have to do to meet what we call Euro NCAP, for example, which are particular standards in terms of safety, which means that we have to adapt. And the roads, there are more and more cars on the road, so you have to adapt. And I had a very interesting debate with somebody about autonomous vehicles, right? And we'll go back to autonomous vehicles, and I'm sure we will touch on it later. But somebody said, "Oh, it'd be great when we can have some autonomous vehicles on the road." Well, the problem is the mix is the dangerous thing, is it not?
So looking forward, then let's sort of okay. So amazing kind of comment to start this conversation, really, about sort of more in the next than the previous 40. Let's unpack that a little bit. So bring that to life for me.
Well, I think the major thing that everybody's preoccupied at the moment is electrification.
Mhm.
So how do we bring cars to the roads that are affordable,
Mhm.
that eat up less emissions, or that reduce emissions? And I think that's the most important thing. So the first thing is on the electrification. Do we go full electric? And obviously people are a little bit still reticent about full electric because of the infrastructure Can they charge it, etc.? Is it going to charge fast enough? So you've got electric. So then you've got a choice. Would you go hybrid? Do you go plug-in hybrid? And I think there's a whole array of different choices that people aren't quite sure where they're going. But at the end of the day, if we want to save the planet for our grandchildren, the next generation, we're going to have to make that move. Now, we can keep pushing it, but we've still, at the end of the day, do we want to save this planet? Yeah. So I think there is I think that's one of the major focuses, to be honest with you, is about electrification. It goes without saying, and it's in everybody's conversation about when we're going to go, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is we talk about autonomous vehicles. Many of us are driving cars that are semi-autonomous. Yeah. So when we talk about autonomous vehicles, there are different levels. Yeah. So there's a level 1, which is the lowest, and there's level 4, 5, which basically 5 is, hands off, eyes off, brain off. I mean, you just go to sleep. Yeah. Which is a long way away. And if it came in today, it would be so expensive that none of us would be able to afford it. So it's likely to be more public vehicles, public transport. But many of us are driving in cars that are level 2s, level 3s, or level 4s, particularly level 3s, which have all of those, going back to the safety, of all those autonomous ones that we don't realize. I read somewhere that a car that is currently on the road, whether it be a Peugeot, whether it be a Volkswagen, whatever it be, has more code lines in it than an aeroplane. So electrification, I think then we've got autonomous vehicles. And then, of course, we've got the interface of the smartphone. And you want to be able to have a seamless experience from when you move out of your house into your car and all of what we have now on the smartphone, which we can't possibly do without. So I think for me, they're the sort of 3 things that are coming together, which have an impact on how we make our cars, how we sell our cars, and how customers choose their cars. And those 3 things, it's a little bit like, it's not 3-dimensional chess, but it's those 3 things are all having an impact on manufacturers, on customers, on suppliers, and indeed on the markets. And that's the excitement of how is that going to develop? How is that going to develop? So that would be my sort of take on it.
Kind of, there's a couple of other kind of like sort of nuances to that. One of which is around the concept of ownership, which I think has, again, radically changed in other aspects of our lives, right? Music, from, in terms, and so definitely want to kind of ask you about that. And sort of, I suppose a way of getting a second cheeky question at the same time, which is around this sort of view of, is it all about electrification? I mean, you talked about sort of, the nature of sort of, combustion, sort of, and we can unpack that a little bit, but there are other sources of, and so again, would love to kind of expand that, maybe that horizon beyond 5 years, as it were. But yeah, so there's 2 questions.
Why are we so pushing? Why are manufacturers pushing electrification? Well, in Europe, it's because of legislation. Yeah. Because electrification is the route that's been chosen, maybe not for the UK, but the UK is following the European Union, or when the UK was in the European Union. And if manufacturers don't meet those standards, even though the European Union is thinking of maybe pushing the timing, etc., there are enormous penalties. And indeed that's true in the UK with the ZEV mandate. So, manufacturers are being forced to build and develop electric cars. And just to give you an idea of the cost of that, then for a big group like Stellantis, and it's true for any other big group, is the cost of electrification is something like 40 to 50 billion euros that those manufacturers have had to invest for the technology of the batteries, of how you build the cars, the manufacturing, the supply chains, what have you, and the technology. Yeah. So it's very difficult for manufacturers to step back and say, okay, now let's go back to having the old diesel and petrol, because what are they going to do? So this is why a lot of manufacturers, and in fact most manufacturers, have really pushed electric vehicles, but are also at the same time recognizing that it's this sort of, I wouldn't say reticence, but electric vehicles are expensive. They're becoming less expensive now as there's more coming on the market. Have developed hybrid vehicles, which is sort of in between. yeah, which is a reduction in CO2, but not as much. It's obviously not zero emission. So, that's the reason that we're pushing electrification. Are there other? Of course there are.
Hmm.
Um, there are hydrogen cell, for example, hydrogen fuel cell. And at Stellantis, for example, and it's true for Ford, it's true for the other major ones, is that they have large vans, commercial vehicles that have fuel cell. Not been so developed yet for smaller cars because it is quite a large technology in itself. So you need quite a big a base to be able to put it on. But fuel cells is one of the ways that it could go. Now, obviously, at the moment, fuel cells and hydrogen stations are really only in France and Germany, nowhere else, yeah? But that could be one. So there are also things that are being done with electric vehicles on the batteries, which is what we call the chemistry, the mix of how much lithium. Maybe you actually can have less lithium because it's a very, obviously, rare, and we need to be careful about where it's mined, etc., what have you. And maybe there's a different mix of the chemistry that you can use for the electric vehicles that isn't what we currently have now, that would make it much more efficient. You wouldn't have to have great big batteries, so you could have, because you have a better chemistry mix, which means you don't have very heavy vehicles, which means you lose less CO2, and so on and so on. Right. So, of course, yes, there are things, and they will come very quickly. I mean, we're moving very rapidly. The technology for the electric vehicles and the batteries that we used 3-4 years ago is now redundant, and it's been replaced by new technology. So I think the answer to your question on that one is yes. There are things always being. E-fuel is another one that's being looked at, being pushed, which is a very clever way of actually synthesizing the fuel. In Brazil, they use biofuel made from whatever, seaweed and algae and whatever it may be. So there are many ways, but in Europe, we've been pushed a little bit because of the legislation. So it's interesting how that will go. And different countries and different regions have found different solutions. And that's why we need to be a little bit less dogmatic and a little cleverer about how we move forward. That's a personal opinion, but I mean, yeah. So that is, yeah, of course, I absolutely, totally agree with you. And in by 10 years' time, will we just be driving around in the electric vehicles we see today? No, I'm sure there will be something more, and people are developing it all the time. But we have to see it as it goes.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And I'm going to come back to the kind of global perspective later on in this conversation. So let's talk about sort of ownership.
Traditionally, and we go back 40 years, you owned your car. Yeah. Many people paid cash for it. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they paid cash. Of course, hardly anybody pays cash for a car now, and you have it on finance. But most people, it's particularly actually interesting for leasing, which is very, very popular now in the UK and across Europe and indeed in the world. And I think there was a statistic that said on electric vehicles, 80% of vehicles are leased these days. And leasing is one that you never own the car, but you continually replacing it. Yeah. So you've got, as you say, you've got that, which is a different way. You don't own your car. You lease it, you pay a rent, a bit like a subscription for your phone, and so on. That's one way. Then there is another way, which is called subscription, which is literally going down the route of the phone, which means that you pay so much a month and you have access to a car. It's not been done so widely yet, right, but it's quite an interesting route. If you live in London, for example, I mean, you probably don't need a car unless you're going to go out of the area, and therefore you could have a subscription. Okay, you could say, well, I'll rent a car or whatever. Some people do, yeah. And then you come to the big question of the youngsters of today. Are they going to be able to afford to buy a car, or do they want a car? And that depends on where you live. And it also depends on your age. Now, obviously, if you live in London or you live in Paris like I do, you've got a fairly efficient underground system. And why do you need a car? Yeah. But when you move out into the provinces, when you move out into, I don't know, the sticks, it's the public transport isn't. So you've got to have access to a car. And that's where the big emphasis on is, then again, how do people own cars, second-hand cars? Do they lease the car? Do they have a subscription? Or do they just use Uber and etc.? And that is a real challenge for both manufacturers, but also the dealers, as we call them, because their business model is changing. Yeah. So the traditional one of a dealer is that he sells used cars, he sells new cars, and he sells his after sales, people coming in to have their cars. So if we sort of divert tangent slightly, and apologies, but that's an interesting model too, because less people are buying cars, so they're leasing them. Okay, they're still going to have to go into a dealership. Secondhand cars, yes, still there. But after sales, that business is not dying, but it's reducing dramatically because electric vehicles need less maintenance, less parts. So that's something, if you go to the wider picture, is changing. But going back to ownership, yes, you're absolutely right. Less and less people are owning their cars. More and more people are leasing. They're very, very popular. And then there's this big question about the young people of today. Do they want to own a car? And it depends on where they live. And it also depends. We did some research some years back, 2 or 3 years back. And interestingly, between 18 and 25, why do I need a car, etc.? And it's only when you get past 25 when you're probably going to have a partner, family,
right.
etc. And, going to the supermarket with 3 kids is not a very exciting thing on the bus. Some people have to do it. So that also changes people's minds.
The thing that's really interesting to me, particularly with your sort of experience and role, I suppose, is the different sort of perspectives that you've learnt through your career from a geographic perspective as well. And because you talked briefly about sort of the UK and Europe and so forth, but I'd love to kind of get your perspectives, in the clouds now, I suppose, looking across the world, like China and India and you mentioned Brazil, all of these different kind of market kind of forces going on around those geographies. How's that kind of playing out from your perspective?
No, I mean, that is fascinating because, and that was a joy to be responsible worldwide because every region is different and they're all at different levels. And when we talk about, when we're talking about electrification, we're talking about Europe. Let's be perfectly honest. And we're talking about some parts of Europe which are very far down the line and some that aren't. Norway is 90% electric. Yeah. But it's been supported by the government, infrastructure, what have you. So let's go across the world. So let's go to Brazil, for example, or South America. Brazil is a very, very tiny market for electric. Electricity is is quite expensive, and it is therefore not really viable for the population. So they've gone down a route of using biofuels, which is a different way of trying to reduce the CO2. But it still keeps the cost down of the cars. But then you could go across to China. China, 5, 6 years ago, nobody talked about electric vehicles in China. None at all. I remember going to a Shanghai Motor Show and there was very few Chinese manufacturers and very few electric cars. And then I went about 3 years ago, just before COVID, and there were a couple of manufacturers, and it started to do it. And then COVID happened, and I don't know what they did in COVID, and let's not go through that, but I mean, they developed electric vehicles. And basically now, it is an electric vehicle country. And they lead the way in the providing of batteries and all of these things. And of course, you've got very famous Chinese companies who produce very good vehicles, like BYD, for example, who are overtaking Tesla in sales in Europe. So that was a market that changed literally in 5 years. But it's all about having the right infrastructure, the right support, and the financing, and forcing people to go that way. And then you can go to one of the last countries I visited in when I was doing the last job was Malaysia. Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. Very small electric because people can't afford electric cars. Yeah. So there you're into, still people are wanting to use diesel because it's the most economical for them. So there you're trying to convert those people into a hybrid, yeah, because at least that's going to move it. But it's amazing that we tend to have a very ideal view about, electrification. Everybody's going that way, but everybody's at different speeds, and it's only natural. And then you talked about India. India is a lovely example, and India want to go electric. And certainly, for example, Citroën, we're launching some electric vehicles over there. But again, it's all about affordability. It's about affordability, and it's also about the supply and the infrastructure of the electricity. So I think you've got all of these diverse things, and you actually have to look at each region separately and think, how's that going to happen, and when will it be? And it's not going to be that we're all going to be driving electric cars worldwide in 2030. And then, of course, you go to the States, and that's who knows what's going to happen there.
We've talked a lot about change already, but what we haven't talked about, I suppose, in a sense, are the people who are directly affected by that change in the industry itself. Tell me a little bit about sort of your perspectives on skills. How have skills evolved, gaps, challenges, opportunities, how you've overcome them, and how you see that playing out?
Well, I mean, that is a major, major transformation of the business, of the automotive business, let's be perfectly honest. And it started, I mean, I as I say, been in this career, 40 odd years. And I remember when I first joined Jaguar, and indeed many manufacturers are exactly the same. There's factories at that time had no robots, yeah, no robots. So people were doing very physical work, and it was very hard work. And of course, then now if you go into a factory, I'll talk about two different sorts of, one factory which is manufacturing vehicles, assembling vehicles, etc. An awful lot of it is done by, all of the heavy work is done by robots. And of course, you've got humans there, but their roles have changed. Yes. And people have had to change skills. And interestingly, where you see most human interaction in a factory, wherever you go in the world, automotive, is in the quality. And whilst, of course, you can have robots that are measuring using lasers, etc., to make sure, you still got at the end of the line somebody with a pair of gloves still going over that, because it's the precision of the person. But of course, you have much technology before that. So I think, if you like, the skills have changed. And I can sort of quote one, which is, I think, really interesting, is the move to electrification meant that all of the people that were originally building the engines, the powertrain, etc., on the old diesels and petrols or diesels, etc., aren't needed. So certainly within Stellantis, we were retraining those people to be able to work on electric vehicles, because that's completely different. In dealerships, you're having to deal with batteries, etc., so people were having to retrained. And indeed, also, we were retraining people to work in gigafactories, because we opened a gigafactory in France, which means those skills, I mean, a gigafactory is completely different from a factory. I mean, building vehicles, it's unbelievable. It's like a laboratory. Yeah.
Bring it to life for me a little bit. That sounds
Well,
fascinating.
I went to visit the gigafactory we have, which is in the north of France. And everybody, it's very, very limited access to it. It's so they're making batteries, and batteries require very thin sheets of copper with a chemistry, etc. So everything has to be at certain temperatures with no humidity, because the minute you've got humidity within there, it's slightly dangerous. So you have to be very, very careful. So if you go into and you go down the line of the battery, if you like, you are in full white suits, and it looks like something out of outer space as you're going into it. But everything is controlled not to, the centimeter, it's to the millimeter. And it is a completely different, unbelievable experience. So we retrained people to be able to enter into those sort of, which is a completely different type of life. Yeah. So there's that way of training people. But the heavy work, if you like, the very intensive work has gone out of, I mean, it's still not, I take my hat off to the people that work in factories, yeah, because it can be a little bit repetitive and what have you. But the very heavy work is out, and of course, all of the factories now have to adhere to very, very strict ergonomic rules. So you're making sure that the vehicle tilts this way, so the person doesn't have to bend, etc., etc., etc. So I think those sort of skills, and I'm just talking, about the physical skills. But what else has happened is that now manufacturers have to have software factories. Yeah, because everything in the car is controlled by software.
More code than a plane, right?
More code than a plane. So we have, everyone has a software factory. Everybody's trying to steal people from everywhere else.
And you're probably competing against Meta and OpenAI.
Exactly, Google or whatever
Yeah,
it may be.
yeah.
You're competing with all of these people because they're the same skills that you need now. And it always amazes me when people say, I don't want to go into the automotive business because it's dirty. You have to work in a workshop and what have you. I mean, those days are gone. I mean, the workshops in the dealers are not dirty places anymore because it's managed by diagnostic boxes. It's done by software. And you go into the automotive manufacturer's development and you're into very, very high level software, AI, etc., etc. So the world has changed, and therefore the skills that, if you like, we need of those people coming in has changed.
Linda, you're a leader. You've reached the very, very top, right? And there's no other way of saying it. You're a woman who's done that in an industry that some people may consider to be macho, right? I guess I'd love to kind of just get your perspectives on that and how you think about sort of building, a more diverse, and equal kind of workplace and culture.
I think it's super important. When I think about just a simple fact, 50% of my customers, when I was selling Peugeots or Citroëns or anywhere, were women. So why wouldn't I want women to be within? And it's not just women, it's diversity and ethnicity, gender, or whatever it may be. So I think it's super, super important. And I think the automotive business has a perception that it is very masculine. And that's built up over time. And probably, and to be honest with you, I can go back 40, 30 years go back 20 years when I was in senior management and going into a big, senior management conference, 250 people, and there were 2 women, which is ridiculous, yeah? So I think for me, I need to, and I try to do as much work as I can in encouraging women to come into this industry, because going back to what I just said, there are so many opportunities, and that's the reason I came into it 40 years ago, and now there's even more. I mean, I'm glad to be retiring, but I'm quite sad to retire because I think it'd be so exciting, But I mean, there is so much, because when you buy a car, I would say 99% of us buy a car with emotion, because it says something about us. I've chosen that whatever, yeah, because I like the design, I like the brand, I like whatever it may be, whatever we choose. So you're actually dealing with not a commodity, you're dealing with something, a sexy product, in my opinion. Some people might not think it, but I think so, yeah. After that, you've got all of the very complicated supply systems, logistics systems, manufacturing, the design of those vehicles. Not only the design exterior, but all of the interior trim, the ergonomics, where do you put this, etc., etc. You've got, how do you sell it? Do you sell it online? Do you sell via a dealership? Do you have experience? I mean, customer journey, yeah. So I want to get more women into this, and I think we need to change people's perceptions. And some about 2 years ago, I did some work with the Institute of Motor Industry it was a campaign for changing the perception and encouraging diversity, embracing diversity. And I don't want to just restrict it to women, because it's not, it's a whole thing, gender, ethnicity, etc. And we want to encourage more people to come into this industry because it's so exciting. And as we just said, there's so many exciting things going to happen. But I think it's got a bad reputation. And I can even go back to a little anecdote. I couldn't really do it very much now, but a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I used to do mystery shops. And a mystery shop is you go into a dealership and you pretend that you want to buy a car, yeah? So I would go in with my husband, and it sounds caricaturial, but it actually happened. So I'd go in and the salesman, there's never a saleswoman, the salesman would say, oh, what car does madam look like? She looked, oh, yes. And we talk about the colour, we talk about the trim. And then the minute it got to finance, the guy would turn to my husband and say, let's talk finance, which is so unbelievably bad. Yeah. I hope it doesn't happen now, but I have an awful feeling that it probably does. And that is what sounds like a very extreme, but I actually experienced that. Yeah. You're a woman, you can't possibly talk about finance. I mean, come on. I was a finance director at the time, which is ridiculous. Yeah. So I take that as an example, and that goes back to perception again. So, and that would be true in many, I'm sure, in many industries. It's not just the automotive one. So I think it's about perceptions, and we need to encourage more women. And I think, often women say, yeah, but how can I get to the top? I get asked that question. Well, of course, it's like anybody. It's true for a man. It's true for anybody. You have to work hard. It's no secret recipe. It's not a magic wand that you can wave. You have to work hard. And sometimes you have to be prepared to compromise. So we can't all be at that level. We can't all be chiefs. We need to have everybody else in the team. And everybody has a part to play. So I think I always say to people, think in your mind, do you really want to get there? Because you will have to compromise in your life. But we should have more women. There should be no glass ceiling, let's be honest.
Really interesting. And I think, look, this conversation, you're painting a very, very different industry, a very, very different kind of working kind of, workplace, from this conversation. So clearly these kind of perceptions of, being, challenged, and so on, that, which is great to hear. Let's talk about sort of qualities of the sorts of people that you like to kind of surround yourself with, so like, what are those kind of, I suppose in a sense, sort of like, what are those key sort of, what do you look for in people? How do you nurture that kind of performance and thriving kind of culture?
Well, I like to have people that have a very open mind. I have a management style which is very open. I like discussion. I love teams and working with my teams. Obviously, at the end of the day, you have to make the decision, but I love working and being able to discuss that. So the first thing is I want people that are willing to take responsibility and willing to express their views, and not just agree with everything I say. I mean, that's ridiculous, yeah? So I like people that will challenge me. So I think once you've got that idea then I love people that are a little bit, how can I put it, disruptive, yeah? Because we are in a challenging world, yeah? And those challenges means that you have to think outside the box. So I love people that are, oh, I've just got a good idea, or do you think we could do that? Rather than people that say, well, we can't do that. It will never happen. So I think, I like those sort of people. Afterwards, it's all about, do you get on with them? I don't like people that can't manage in a team. Yeah. I mean, we've all got egos. I mean, that's and the further you go up, the bigger your ego gets, apparently. But what you can't have is a team of people or they're all pushing their own individual cases. So there is no way now that you can do things if you're not in a team. I couldn't have done my job if I didn't have a fantastic team. Yeah. Because you can't manage everything. If you think about the job that I've just retired from, you're in charge of the world, you're in charge of the product, you're in charge of the marketing, you're in charge of all of those things. Well, A, you can't be an expert in all of those things. And B, you can't possibly micromanage all of those things. I mean, Superman couldn't do that, or Superwoman couldn't do that, yeah? So you have to have people that you can trust and people that you can delegate to. And I think that's where you get to what sort of people. Well, they're the people that you think you can trust and that you feel that are on your wavelength.
How do you create a culture where you're able to instill that sense of, I suppose, ultimate kind of like confidence or safety, that it's okay to experiment, it's okay to challenge? Because clearly
super difficult. Yeah.
That's why I wanted to ask you the question.
No, it's super difficult because no matter which industry you're in, there's always a blame culture, isn't there, that you have to try and avoid. Well, the way that I've done it is trying to get the right people leading. I think that's the most important thing, because if I adopt a blame culture, then that will go to them and they will pass it down and pass it down. So I think you've got to start at the very, very top. Culture starts at the top, let's be honest with you. And you won't have a fantastic culture or the culture that you want if your CEO and your management team don't believe in it or are just paying lip service to it. So that's the first thing. And then it's about involving people. You know, I'm a big believer of getting the people to decide what the culture is. Yeah. Rather than me saying the culture is going to be this, which is a bit ridiculous. Yeah. So, I mean, I've in a number of when I've gone into new roles, I start by pulling everybody together and we have little workshops about what do we think. And, I don't think it's about having a culture, but it's about having the way that you work. Yeah. And I think it's about having respect for each other that makes the difference. And the respect is not only about I can express my opinion without being blamed, but it's also you respect people's time. And I hate to use the word because it's become a bit of a word that's life balance, but I think it's super important. And certainly in the past couple of roles that I've had, I've introduced working with the team what we call life balance, which is you respect people's lives. These days, you've got to do that. And gone are the days where you could make people work till 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night. Why should they? Yeah, you've got to find a life balance, and that's quite unusual. And whether it's just me doing that, I'm sure, but I'm sure there are other people doing it. So we introduced, the sort of feel good rules, if you like, which was, no emails at the weekend and no meetings after 6:30 or whatever it may be, depending on the culture and what have you. And that was ultra important. And that gained the respect of the people because why? Because I respected it and my management team respected it. And the minute that doesn't happen, then people don't believe you and your credibility's shot, yeah? So I think culture builds from that, but it's super important that you don't sort of impose a culture, but you bring people along with the culture, I think.
That's fascinating. I love that leadership by example point as well. Um, okay, former finance director. Um,
Yeah.
fantastic. So this one's going to be going to be really interesting for me to hear the answer to this one. So when you think about metrics, and I don't mean that in its broadest sense, and you can answer it however you like. Like how do you kind of what are the kind of the measures and the metrics that you kind of almost live and work by? What are your go-tos?
So first of all, I mean, if I just talk about how I used to measure myself and how I was measured. So if you're in charge of, let's say you're in charge of a Peugeot, Citroen, Volkswagen, or whatever it may be, let's just take a car company, then we were measured on three things: quality, so customer satisfaction. Yeah. Secondly was profitability. And the third one was your market share or your volume. And I would add a fourth one, which isn't necessarily within that role, but is in a general finance one, which is cash. Because at the end of the day, cash is king. If you don't have cash, you don't exist. So very simple ones. And I think if you have any more than five, it's too complicated. And let's be honest, what are you trying to do? Well, first of all, if you're in a service industry of anything who you're providing, you need to have a customer base because if you don't have repeat customers, it's going to cost you a lot. So customer satisfaction, super important. Second one is not about volume, it's about the profit. And you've got to find the balance because everybody can push volume, but you make no money. Yeah. So profit linked with volume. And then, of course, cash. So you need to make sure that you've got cash to be able to invest and etc. So I've taken it very simply.
Yeah.
But afterwards, of course, you need to be able to look at a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement, all of those things. But you need to make sure that you look at those things. And then afterwards, it's about, what's your positioning in a market? How much of a additional added value can you add? Can you, have a position? This is where is your brand, is your brand able to have higher prices because you're perceived to be premium? I don't know, whatever it may be. Then, of course, you come into the intricacies of your pricing power and all of these sort of things. But simplistically, and I probably answered it too simplistically, and apologies, customer quality, profit, volume, cash flow.
Brilliant. I think it's hard to sometimes make things simple, and you've done that. Let's go back to Linda when she was considering university or taking the job at Jaguar. What advice would you give to her today, knowing what you now know?
Do it. I wouldn't change. I have been in this industry for 40 odd years and I have never regretted it. And as I say, I would work another 40 odd years if I could live that long. Um, so no, I would say go for it. Go for it. I wouldn't change. I think sometimes you have to take a bit of a gamble, yeah? And I think that's quite difficult to do if you're going to gamble. I gambled, I mean, take risks slightly, yeah? And I did it a couple of times. I did it first when I went into and decided not to go to university and stop in the automotive industry and work my way up. And my parents at the time, my dad was a civil servant, and he looked at me as though I'd gone out of my mind completely, but supported me, so that was good, yeah. But it was a bit of a risk. I mean, okay, you're 18, 19. I mean, how much of a risk is it? But at the time, it's a little bit of a risk. And I think the second risk, or if you like, coming out of your comfort zone, let's put it that way, was when I decided that I wanted to work abroad, and I wanted to work in France. And that is quite different because I'm going back to the late 1990s, early 2000. And I decided that I wanted to work, and the company that I was working with got me a finance director's position in France, based in Paris. And that was my start of working between France, back to UK, back to France, and what have you. But that was like a culture change, absolute culture change. Going back then it was, because France at that point was not very Anglo-Saxon. And now, I mean, there's so many international companies and that it's very, very similar. But it was very hierarchical, it was very traditional, it was very conservative. And of course, I was testing my A-level French, which was also a challenge, yeah? So that I completely went out of my comfort zone. And I think you have to have a bit of a sort of self-confidence. And of course, you have to have the support of the people around you, yeah? But I think sometimes, you do need to do that because you miss the opportunities. I'm always envious about people who say, my career plan is I'm going to, at 18, I'm going to university. After that, I'm going to get this job. Then I'm going to go have that job. Then I'm going to do this job. And then, I mean, my career has never worked like that. It's just been, oh, there's an opportunity. Let's go for it. Oh, that makes a good idea. And you sort of evolve. And I think that's the best way because you build on your experiences as you go along. Yeah.
You miss all the shots you don't take, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great answer. A really, really deep answer. I love it. Okay, look, I'm going to finish off with a few quick fire questions for you, right? So first thing that comes into your head, you could download any skill into your brain like the Matrix. What would it be?
Creativity in drawing.
Dream passenger that you'd love to share the ride with?
Oh, gosh. Oh, okay. Nelson Mandela.
Oh, beautiful choice. One piece of tech from sci-fi that you wished existed today?
Well, it probably exists, actually, but I'd like something that was a butler who would do everything for me.
AI robot?
AI robot. Well, I mean,
okay.
I suppose I could just have a
you
human
have
butler.
Jeeves, couldn't you, I
could have
suppose,
Jeeves. Yeah. I want a AI Jeeves.
Okay, love it. Okay. You could teleport anywhere on the planet or beyond. Where's the first place you'd go?
Southeast Asia. I love Southeast Asia.
You got a favourite country? You mentioned Malaysia earlier.
I love Malaysia, but I love Vietnam.
Great choice. Ultimate driving song?
I haven't got one, actually. I'm just desperately trying to think of one. Oh.
I've got you on the foot here. Right?
Yeah, you have. I think it would depend on who I'm with.
Yes.
And it would depend on where I'm going. But probably I would have something like, I don't know, if it was noisy and everything, something to sing along. Yeah. I don't know, Queen or something like that.
That's it, windows down.
Exactly, windows down. Something like Queen, We Are the Champions or something like that.
Can't go wrong with that.
Very old-fashioned, though.
Oh, it's a classic. Linda, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.